Bible Study, Chapter 10. Paul, appointed as an apostle through Jesus Christ. The ministry of the apostle, tearing down spiritual strongholds with the authority of Christ, and boasting only in the Lord within the gospel. Now I, Paul, myself am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beg you that when I am present I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ's, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ's, even so we are Christ's. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, such we will also be in deed when we are present. For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us, a sphere which especially includes you. For we are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not extend to you, for it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope, that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. When looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 18, from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, this word is not a defense where the Apostle Paul intends to assert his own authority, but a content speaking about the spiritual battle of defending the gospel and tearing down thoughts and false teachings that distort the gospel. First, Paul mentions the people who criticize him. Some people said that Paul speaks strongly when he is far away, but is weak when they meet him in person. They were evaluating Paul by a fleshly standard. However, Paul says that his attitude does not come from a human personality or strength, but comes from the meekness and gentleness of Christ. The minister who preaches the gospel is not a person who rules people with the power or coercion of the world, but a person who serves souls with the faith, believing the righteousness of Christ. But at the same time, Paul is very resolute against thoughts and false teachings that distort the gospel. He says that although they live in the flesh, the warfare spoken of here is a warfare against those who oppose the truth. Paul says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds." Looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, this weapon is not human logic or philosophy, but the power of the gospel of salvation of Jesus Christ. Worldly religious thoughts or doctrines intending to establish human righteousness are situated like a stronghold in the hearts of people. However, it is that Jesus Christ received the judgment of those sins on the cross, because he had the sins of the world transferred to him by receiving baptism from John. As we know, the fact is that the word of the gospel of the water and the Spirit becomes the power that tears down the stronghold of Satan. Therefore, Paul says that this gospel of the water and the Spirit tears down all arguments and tears down the proud thoughts that oppose knowing God. Humans intend to advance to God with their own thoughts and religious righteousness. However, the gospel of the water and the Spirit tears down human righteousness and makes every thought obey Christ. In other words, it means making the heart of a person escape from his own righteousness and return to the faith, believing the ministry of salvation of Jesus Christ. Paul also says that the authority given by God is not for tearing down a person, but for building him up. The authority of the apostle preaching the gospel of the water and the Spirit is an authority for building a person up upon the gospel. The gospel of the water and the Spirit is not a message that tears down a person, but a gospel that saves from sin and reconciles with God. Paul says that he does not boast of himself. He says that he works only within the sphere of the ministry that God entrusted to him. He says that he already came even to the church of Corinth with the gospel of Christ. This shows that the gospel ministry is not for expanding human achievements, but is a work accomplished according to the mission entrusted by God. Also, Paul hopes that as the faith of the saints of the church of Corinth grows, the gospel will be preached to wider places. The purpose of the gospel ministry does not lie in exalting one's own name, but places its purpose in letting the gospel be preached to more places. Therefore, Paul speaks like this: "He who glories, let him glory in the Lord." What a person can boast of in the gospel ministry is not his own ability or achievement, but only the history of salvation accomplished by the Lord. Also, it means that being approved by people is not important, but being approved by the Lord is important. Looking from the perspective of the gospel of the water and the Spirit, the ministry of the apostle is not a work for human honor, but is doing the work of tearing down the wrong thoughts and religious righteousness inside the hearts of people by preaching the gospel of salvation of Jesus Christ. The power of an evangelist does not come from human strength, but comes from the power of God's gospel. Ultimately, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 18, shows the essence of the gospel ministry. The gospel ministry is not a work of competing with people, but a spiritual warfare of tearing down the false thoughts that oppose the truth and making the hearts of people obey Christ. And the purpose of that ministry is to exalt only the Lord, not a person, and to boast of the power of the gospel within the Lord.